October 25, 1944, 0700 hours, the Philippine Sea east of Samar Island. Commander Ernest Evans stands on the bridge of the destroyer USS Johnston, watching colored geysers erupt around his ship, pink, red, greenish yellow. Each towering splash marks the impact of shells heavier than automobiles, fired from battleships that should not be here. Through his binoculars, Evans can see pagoda masts on the horizon, the unmistakable silhouette of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most powerful warships. The largest battleship ever constructed is bearing down on his position at 27 knots, her 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells, weighing 3,200 pounds over 26 miles. Evans does not wait for orders. He turns to his crew and commands all hands to general quarters. Prepare to attack major portion of the Japanese fleet. All engines ahead flank. Commence making smoke and stand by for a torpedo attack. His ship displaces 2,100 tons. The enemy battleship Yamato alone displaces more than 64,000. The mathematics of this engagement are impossible. But Ernest Evans, a Cherokee and Creek sailor from Pawnee, Oklahoma, is already swinging his destroyer toward the entire Japanese fleet at 35 knots, alone. What follows over the next 2.5 hours would become the most lopsided surface naval engagement in American history. A battle so improbable that the Navy's official historian Samuel Eliot Morison would later write that in no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours off Samar. This is the story of how 13 American ships, outgunned by a factor of 30 to 1, charged the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled, and won. To understand how this impossible battle came to be, we must travel back several days and several hundred miles to the west, where the largest naval operation in history was unfolding across the Philippine archipelago. By October 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical turning point. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines, landing over 132,000 troops on the island of Leyte on October 20th. For the Japanese High Command, this invasion represented an existential threat. The Philippines sat astride the sea lanes connecting Japan to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Losing them would sever the fuel supply that kept the Imperial fleet operational. Without oil, the battleships and carriers of the combined fleet would become nothing more than floating steel monuments to a dying empire. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, understood what was at stake. He made the decision that would set everything in motion. There would be no sense, he said, in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of the Philippines. He activated Operation Show Go, a desperate gamble that would commit nearly every remaining warship in the Japanese Navy to a single decisive battle. The plan was elegant in its audacity. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would take 4 aircraft carriers north of the Philippines. These carriers were nearly empty of planes, their aviators having been killed in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot just 4 months earlier. Their sole purpose was to serve as bait, luring the powerful American Third Fleet away from the beachhead. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would lead the main striking force through the San Bernardino Strait to fall upon the unprotected American transports in Leyte Gulf. A third force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would attack from the south through Surigao Strait. If the plan worked, the Japanese fleet would catch the American invasion force in a devastating pincer movement. The soldiers already ashore would be cut off from reinforcement and supply. MacArthur's triumphant return to the Philippines would become a catastrophic defeat. The bait worked perfectly. On October 24th, American search planes located Ozawa's carriers to the north. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet from the battleship New Jersey, took the news with eager anticipation. Here was the opportunity he had been waiting for since Pearl Harbor, the chance to destroy Japan's carrier force once and for all. Halsey took all 8 of his fleet carriers and 6 fast battleships in pursuit, racing north at maximum speed to destroy what he believed was the main Japanese threat. Halsey was convinced that Kurita's force had been decisively beaten the previous day in the Sibuyan Sea. American aircraft from Task Force 38 had found Kurita's ships and attacked them relentlessly. They sank the super battleship Musashi after hitting her with approximately 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. They damaged the battleships Yamato and Nagato and forced Kurita to reverse course, When aerial scouts reported the Japanese turning west, away from San Bernardino Strait, Halsey concluded that the center force was retreating. But Kurita had not been beaten. He had merely turned around temporarily to escape the air attacks. That night, under cover of darkness, his battered but still formidable force reversed course and passed through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. A critical miscommunication had left the strait completely unguarded. Halsey had earlier sent a preparatory message outlining a contingency plan to form Task Force 34, a powerful battleship group to guard the passage, but he never actually issued the execute order. Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid of the 7th Fleet received the preparatory message and assumed these battleships were already in position. They were not. Kincaid's own battleships were far to the south, having just annihilated Nishimura's southern force in Surigao Strait. No one was watching San Bernardino Strait when Kurita's 23 warships emerged at 00:35 hours on October 25th, slipping into the Philippine Sea in the dead of night. Steaming south along the coast of Samar, Kurita's force was now bearing down on the most vulnerable American units in the entire Pacific, a collection of slow escort carriers and their tiny screening ships that had been left behind to support the ground troops ashore. Task Unit 77.4.3, radio callsign Taffy 3, was never designed to fight a surface battle. Commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, nicknamed Ziggy, the unit consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. 13 ships in total. The escort carriers were Casablanca-class vessels, mass-produced by Kaiser Shipbuilding from converted merchant ship hulls. Henry Kaiser had promised to deliver 50 of these ships in a single year, and he had kept that promise. But speed of construction came at the cost of combat capability. The escort carriers displaced less than 11,000 tons, fully loaded, could make only 19 knots at maximum speed, and carried a single 5-inch gun mounted on the stern. Their thin steel hulls, designed to save weight and materials, offered no protection against armor-piercing shells. The sailors who served on them had a grim joke about what the designation CVE stood for: combustible, vulnerable, expendable. The 3 destroyers, Johnston, Hoel, and Heermann, were Fletcher-class ships, the workhorses of the American destroyer fleet. They displaced about 2,500 tons, could make 35 knots in a sprint, and carried 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes in 2 quintuple mounts. The 4 destroyer escorts, Samuel B Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond, were even smaller at 1,700 tons, with only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes apiece. They had been designed to hunt submarines, not to fight battleships. The total displacement of all 13 ships in Taffy 3 was approximately 61,000 tons. Yamato alone weighed more than that. The combined firepower of the American force, measured by shell weight per minute, was barely 5% of what the Japanese could deliver. Admiral Sprague's flagship was the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay. He was a slim, scholarly-looking officer with a receding hairline and spectacles, hardly the image of a warrior. But Clifton Sprague had been a naval aviator since 1921. He had commanded carriers in combat, earned 2 Navy Crosses, and survived the destruction of his ship at the Battle of Midway. He understood naval warfare, and he understood immediately that his task unit was facing annihilation. At 6:30 that morning, the carriers had just secured from routine dawn general quarters. Sailors were heading to breakfast. The sun was climbing over a calm sea dotted with scattered rain squalls. Pilots were preparing for another day of ground support missions, bombing and strafing Japanese positions ashore. It was supposed to be a quiet day. At 6:37, Ensign William Brooks, flying a torpedo bomber from the carrier St. Lo on routine anti-submarine patrol, spotted ships on the horizon that he initially assumed belonged to Admiral Halsey's fleet. Admiral Sprague demanded identification. Brooks flew closer, descending through scattered clouds for a better look. Then he radioed back with words that would change everything. "I can see pagoda masts," he reported. "I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw." Within minutes, lookouts on the American carriers could see anti-aircraft fire erupting to the northwest as the Japanese ships fired at Brooks's plane. Surface radar confirmed what no one wanted to believe. A massive formation of capital ships was less than 20 miles away and closing fast at nearly 30 knots. The operators could count 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and at least 11 destroyers. At 6:58, Yamato's main battery thundered. The largest naval guns ever put to sea, 18.1 inches in diameter, had opened fire at a range of nearly 20 miles. Each shell weighed 3,200 pounds and travelled at speeds exceeding 1,600 miles per hour. 3 minutes later, shells began falling among the American carriers. Admiral Sprague watched coloured geysers rise around his ships. The Japanese used dye markers in their shells to help each ship track its own fall of shot. Yamatos were yellow, Nagatos were pink, Kongos were red, Harunas were greenish-yellow. It looked like a deadly rainbow erupting from the sea. Sprague later recalled the moment in his action report, asking himself what chance they could possibly have. 6 jeep carriers, each armed with only one 5-inch pea shooter, against the 18-inch, 16-inch, 14-inch, and 8-inch broadsides of the enemy. But Sprague did not freeze. He immediately ordered his carriers to turn east into the wind to launch aircraft. He directed all ships to make smoke, laying down a thick white curtain between his carriers and the Japanese guns. He steered toward a rain squall on the horizon that might provide temporary cover. And at 700 hours, just minutes after the Japanese opened fire, he gave an order that amounted to a death sentence for his escorts. Small boys attack. Commander Evans on Johnston did not wait to receive that order. The moment the Japanese fleet was sighted, he had already turned his ship toward the enemy and was racing at flank speed to close the distance. His executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagan, later described Evans as a fighting man from the soles of his broad feet to the ends of his straight black hair. He was an Oklahoman and proud of the Indian blood he had in him. We called him, though not to his face, the Chief. Ernest Edwin Evans had been born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, on August 13, 1908. His mother was part Cherokee, his father part Creek. He was proud of his Native American heritage, and never tried to hide it, even in an era when such ancestry was often treated as something to be ashamed of. He had grown up in the red dirt country of Oklahoma during the Great Depression, a time and place that taught young men the value of toughness, determination, and standing up for what was right, regardless of the odds. Evans enlisted in the Navy at 17, served a year as a seaman, then won appointment to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. He graduated in 1931 from a class of 441 cadets. His career had taken him across the Pacific, including command of the destroyer Alden during the desperate early days after Pearl Harbor. He had seen what the Japanese fleet could do to unprepared American forces, and he had learned that American sailors could fight back effectively when properly led and trained. When Evans was assigned to commission and command Johnston in the fall of 1943, he threw himself into making her the finest destroyer in the fleet. He drilled his crew relentlessly. He demanded excellence in gunnery, in damage control, in seamanship. His men worked harder than crews on other ships, but they also developed an absolute confidence in their captain and in themselves. When Evans told them Johnston would be a fighting ship, they believed him. By October 1944, Evans had been in command of Johnston for exactly 1 year. He had taken command at her commissioning ceremony in Seattle on October 27, 1943. On that day, he had told his crew something that now seemed prophetic. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who does not want to go along had better get off right now." Now he was making good on that promise. At 7:10, still racing toward the Japanese fleet alone, Johnston opened fire with her 5-inch guns at the heavy cruiser Kumano, nearly 10 miles away. The fire was largely symbolic at that range, the shells unlikely to do significant damage to an armoured cruiser. But Evans was not looking to sink Kumano with gunfire. He was trying to get close enough to use his torpedoes. Over the next 5 minutes, Johnston's gunners poured more than 200 rounds into Kumano's superstructure. They hit her at least 40 times, setting fires and wrecking radar equipment. Then Evans pushed even closer, threading through the coloured shell splashes that erupted all around his charging destroyer. At 7:20, Johnston reached a range of approximately 10,300 yards from Kumano. Evans ordered hard rudder, swinging his ship broadside, and fired all 10 of his Mark 15 torpedoes in a single spread. The destroyer then ducked behind her own smokescreen, threading through the grey haze while her torpedoes ran hot toward the enemy cruiser. At least one torpedo found its mark. The explosion blew off Kumano's bow, reducing the heavy cruiser to 12 knots and forcing her out of the battle line. The heavy cruiser Suzuya stopped to assist her stricken sister ship, and was subsequently hit by near-miss bombs from American aircraft that bent her propeller shaft. 2 heavy cruisers, knocked out of the battle by 1 destroyer's attack. Johnston emerged from the smoke seemingly untouched by her suicidal charge, but Evans' luck could not hold forever. Moments later, the battleship Yamato found her. What happened next was initially recorded in American reports as hits from the battleship Congo at a range of approximately 14,000 yards, but post-war analysis of Japanese records revealed a different story. Congo was actually blinded by rain squalls at that moment, her main battery rangefinder disabled by strafing aircraft. Japanese action reports show that Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, claimed hits on a cruiser matching Johnston's exact position and time. It was Yamato that crippled Johnston with a single devastating salvo. 3 18.1-inch armor-piercing shells from Yamato's main battery struck Johnston's hull. Because the Japanese had mistaken the destroyer for a cruiser, they used armor-piercing ammunition designed to penetrate thick belt armor. The shells passed through Johnston's thin, unarmored hull without detonating, but they still caused catastrophic damage. 1 struck aft below the waterline, flooding the after engine room. Another wrecked the steering engine. A third knocked out electrical power to the aft gun mounts. Almost simultaneously, 3 6.1-inch shells from Yamato's secondary battery struck Johnston's bridge and superstructure. One survivor described the impact as being like a puppy smacked by a truck. The shells killed or wounded dozens of sailors and shredded the ship's fire control systems. Commander Evans was on the bridge when the shells hit. Shrapnel tore through his body. 2 fingers on his left hand were blown off. His shirt was shredded from his body by the blast. Bleeding heavily from multiple wounds, Evans refused painkillers and ordered all medical attention directed to his wounded sailors. He then guided his crippled ship into a rain squall for emergency repairs. Johnston had been transformed from a nimble greyhound into a limping cripple in seconds. She had lost one of her 2 engines, reducing her speed from 35 knots to 17. She had lost 3 of her 5 guns. She had lost her torpedo tubes, now empty. She had lost her steering engine and her gyro compass. Half her crew was dead or wounded. By any reasonable calculation, Johnston's battle was over. It was not. While Johnston had been making her solo charge, the other escorts of Taffy 3 were also racing into the fight. Destroyer Hoel, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, was first to follow Johnston's lead. At 7:26, Hoel closed to 14,000 yards of the battleship Congo and prepared to launch torpedoes. Before she could fire, the heavy cruiser Haguro spotted her and opened fire. The first salvo put 2 8-inch shells into Hoel's bridge, destroying her main battery director, her radar, and all voice communications. The captain was wounded. Additional shells knocked out 2 of her gun turrets and flooded her engine room, reducing her speed to 17 knots. Hoel was crippled before she could even launch her attack, but Commander Kintberger pressed on anyway. Despite the carnage on his bridge, despite the fires and flooding, despite the dead and wounded sprawled across the deck, he kept his battered ship moving toward the enemy. At approximately 7:27, Hoel fired her first 5 torpedoes at Congo, forcing the battleship to turn away to avoid the spread. Kintberger then swung his ship around to bring the remaining torpedo tubes to bear. Hoel fired her last 5 torpedoes at the Japanese battleship column. These torpedoes, combined with those from Heermann, would have consequences far beyond what anyone expected. For the next hour, Hoel fought on despite her wounds. She was hit more than 40 times by shells ranging from 5 inches to 14 inches. Her crew fought fires, plugged holes, and kept her remaining guns firing as long as ammunition lasted. When her forward fire room flooded, Chief Water Tender Oscar Cromer stayed at his post, keeping the boilers operating until the compartment was completely underwater. He drowned at his station. At approximately 8:55, with all power lost and the ship settling fast, Commander Kintberger ordered abandon ship. Hoel sank at approximately 8:55, taking 253 of her approximately 340-man crew with her. Kintberger survived the battle and the 2 days in the water that followed, earning the Navy Cross for his leadership. Destroyer Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway, made her torpedo run through absolute chaos. Racing at flank speed through the carrier formation, she nearly collided with both Samuel B Roberts and the damaged Hoel in smoke so thick that visibility dropped below 100 yards. Ships were everywhere, guns firing in all directions, shells falling among them like deadly rain. Emerging from the murk, Heermann found herself barely 5,000 yards from the heavy cruiser Haguro. She fired 7 torpedoes at the cruiser, forcing Haguro to take violent evasive action that carried her out of the battle for precious minutes. Heermann then turned toward the battleship column and closed to within 4,400 yards of the battleship Haruna. At that suicidal range, she launched her last 3 torpedoes. The combined torpedo spreads from Heermann and Hoel caught the battleship Yamato in an impossible position. With torpedoes approaching from multiple directions, the largest battleship ever built had only one option. She reversed course and ran. For approximately 10 minutes, Yamato steamed away from the battle at high speed, her 18-inch guns unable to bear on the fleeing American carriers. The most powerful warship in history, with guns capable of reaching targets 26 miles away, had been effectively removed from the fight at the most critical moment by ships that together displaced less than her forward turret. Meanwhile, the smallest combatant in Taffy 3 was preparing to make her own charge. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland had taken command of the destroyer Escort Samuel B Roberts at her commissioning just 6 months earlier. At age 34, he was a naval reserve officer who had practiced law in Tacoma, Washington, before the war called him to sea. He had never expected to command a warship in combat. Now he was about to lead one of the most famous charges in naval history. As his tiny ship turned toward the Japanese fleet, Copeland picked up the intercom microphone and spoke words that every survivor would remember for the rest of their lives. "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted," he said. "They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." Copeland later admitted in interviews that his hands were ice cold from fear as he gave that speech. His voice was calm and steady, but inside he was terrified. Every man on that ship knew they were about to die, but they pressed the attack anyway. Samuel B Roberts was designed to make 24 knots. Her chief engineer, Lieutenant William Trowbridge, bypassed every safety mechanism on her engines, pushing the boilers to 660 pounds per square inch pressure, nearly 100 pounds above their rated maximum. The destroyer Escort achieved 28.7 knots, racing towards ships that outweighed her by a factor of 40. Using smoke for concealment, Roberts steamed to within approximately 4,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Chokai. At that range, so close that Japanese officers could see American sailors running on deck, Chokai's 8-inch guns could not depress far enough to hit the tiny ship below them. The shells passed overhead, striking the carrier Gambia Bay instead. Roberts fired her 3 torpedoes at Chokai. American survivors credited at least one hit that blew off the cruiser's stern. Roberts then turned her guns on the heavy cruiser Chikuma in a broadside duel that should have been over in seconds. A 1,700-ton destroyer Escort against an 11,000-ton heavy cruiser armed with 10 8-inch guns. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was also unforgettable. Samuel B Roberts' aft 5-inch gun, Mount 52, was manned by gunners Mate 3rd Class, Paul Henry Carr. He was 20 years old. He had been married for exactly 1 year and 2 days. He was from Checkasaw, Oklahoma, the same state that had produced Ernest Evans. Under Carr's direction, gun Mount 52 fired an extraordinary 324 rounds in approximately 35 minutes. The shells set Chikuma's bridge ablaze. They destroyed one of her turrets. They killed dozens of Japanese sailors. When electrical power to the gun mount failed after battle damage cut the cables, Carr's crew hand cranked the turret and manually loaded shells, maintaining fire through sheer determination and physical strength. At approximately 900 hours, the battleship Congo ended the fight. A 3-gun salvo of 14-inch shells ripped a 40-foot by 10-foot hole in Roberts's port side. All power was lost. The ship began to settle by the stern. What happened next at gun mount 52 would become one of the most remembered moments of the Pacific War. The gun crew attempted to fire one more round, but the breech had been damaged, and the shell, overheated from the continuous firing, cooked off before the breech could close. The explosion killed or wounded most of the gun crew. A repair party found Paul Carr moments later. He was mortally wounded, his body torn open from his neck to his groin. His intestines were exposed. He was clearly dying, but he was still conscious. and he was still holding an unfired shell in his arms. "Please," he begged the sailors who found him, "help me load this. We have to keep firing. We have to keep firing." Paul Henry Carr died on October 25, 1944. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. The guided missile frigate USS Carr, hull number FFG-52, was later named in his honor, one of the few Navy ships ever named for an enlisted man. While Roberts was making her final stand, the escort carrier Gambia Bay was dying. As the rearmost carrier in the formation, and therefore closest to the Japanese, she had been under fire almost continuously since the battle began. Between 8:10 and 8:50, she absorbed at least 15 major-caliber hits as Japanese cruisers closed to near point-blank range. Her thin hull was torn open in multiple places. Fires burned throughout the ship. Captain Walter Vueg ordered abandon ship at approximately 8:50. Gambia Bay capsized at 9:07 and sank 4 minutes later. She remains the only American aircraft carrier in history to be sunk by enemy surface gunfire. Throughout the battle, the men of Taffy 3's air groups had been throwing themselves at the Japanese fleet with whatever weapons they had available. Most aircraft had been armed for ground support missions, carrying depth charges, anti-personnel bombs, rockets, and machine gun ammunition. Very few had the torpedoes or armor-piercing bombs needed to seriously damage warships. It did not matter. These pilots, many of whom had never attacked a surface ship before, improvised with whatever they had. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable led a flight of Avengers armed with nothing but depth charges and machine guns against the heavy cruiser column. His pilots dove through intense anti-aircraft fire, releasing depth charges that exploded alongside the cruisers and forced them to take evasive action. Other pilots dove on battleships with empty bomb bays, forcing evasive maneuvers that disrupted Japanese gunnery. Lieutenant Paul Garrison flew his Avenger torpedo bomber directly at Yamato, released his weapons, and watched helplessly as the torpedoes failed to explode against the battleship's hull. He then made repeated strafing runs with his .50 caliber machine guns, riddling the battleship's deck with bullets and killing exposed crewmen. Ensign John McGraw made 19 strafing runs against the cruiser Tone, emptying his ammunition, then made 6 additional dry runs to keep the cruiser's gunners distracted. One ensign reportedly emptied his .38 caliber service pistol at a Japanese cruiser during a strafing run. When ammunition ran out, pilots made dry runs, diving repeatedly on enemy vessels to distract their gun crews and disrupt their aim. Several pilots flew until their fuel tanks ran dry, then ditched in the ocean hoping to be rescued. The Wildcat fighters, armed only with .50 caliber machine guns, were completely ineffective against armored warships. But their pilots dove in anyway, raking superstructures and exposed gun crews with bullets. Some pilots flew so low that they came back with radio antenna wires wrapped around their wings, torn from Japanese masts as they screamed past. The Japanese could not tell which attacks were real and which were bluffs. To them, it seemed they faced the full fury of a major American carrier force. Combined with the smoke screens, the rain squalls, and the suicidal torpedo attacks, the relentless air assault convinced Admiral Kurita that he was engaging fleet carriers and cruisers rather than escort carriers and destroyers. While the other escorts fought and died, Commander Evans had brought Johnston back into the battle. With emergency repairs giving him 1 working engine and 2 forward guns, he drove his crippled destroyer back toward the enemy. His ship was listing. She was down by the stern. She could barely make 17 knots. She had no torpedoes left. But Ernest Evans was not finished. Noticing that Gambia Bay was taking fire from multiple cruisers, Evans ordered his gunners to commence firing and draw the enemy's attention away from the carrier. It was a sacrificial act. He was deliberately making his wounded ship a target to save lives on Gambia Bay. Around 8:45, the light cruiser Yahagi and 7 Japanese destroyers launched a torpedo attack against the American carriers. Johnston, crippled on 1 engine, with limited firepower and no torpedoes of her own, turned to intercept the entire enemy destroyer squadron. Evans took his ship across the bows of the approaching destroyers, crossing the T in classic naval fashion. This put all of Johnston's remaining guns in position to fire broadsides, while the Japanese could only respond with their forward mounts. Evans fired into the lead destroyer, disrupting their attack formation and sending their torpedoes wide of the carriers. He engaged each ship in succession, dodging return fire, until the Japanese broke off their attack run. The Japanese destroyers then concentrated their fire on Johnston. They stripped away her mast, her last engine, and her last gun. Evans, wounded and bleeding, commanded from the fantail. He was shouting steering orders through an open hatch to sailors who were turning the rudder by hand in the steering compartment below decks. At 9:45, with his ship dead in the water and burning, Commander Ernest Edwin Evans gave the order to abandon ship. What happened next was witnessed by multiple survivors and later confirmed by Japanese sources. As the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze passed the sinking Johnston, her crew lined the rail. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Masamichi Terauchi, raised his arm and saluted the ship and her survivors struggling in the water. Survivors reported seeing Evans in a lifeboat, battered and bleeding but still alive. He returned the Japanese salute. Johnston sank at approximately 10:10. Commander Ernest Evans was never seen again. Of 327 men aboard, 186 were killed. Then, something inexplicable happened. Between approximately 9:11 and 9:25, with victory seemingly within his grasp, Admiral Kurita signaled his fleet. Zengun Hokushin. All ships, my course north, speed 20. The Japanese were withdrawing. On the American carriers, stunned sailors watched the enemy ships turn away. A signalman on Fanshawe Bay shouted what no one could quite believe. They are getting away. The reasons for Kurita's decision have been debated by naval historians for more than 80 years. He later offered multiple explanations. He believed he was fighting fleet carriers, not escort carriers, and that he had already sunk several of them. He feared additional air attacks would destroy his fleet if it became trapped in Leyte Gulf. His formation had become hopelessly scattered during the chaotic battle, and he had minimal communications with his surviving ships. A false report from another Japanese force suggested an American carrier group lay to the northeast, offering what seemed like a more worthy target. But perhaps the most honest explanation came near the end of his life. Shortly before his death on December 19, 1977, Kurita spoke privately with former Naval Academy students who had become his biographers. He admitted that he had turned back because he did not believe in wasting lives in a futile effort. He had long believed the war was lost. Whatever his reasons, the withdrawal saved what remained of Taffy 3, but the ordeal was not over. At 10:51, as the survivors of the morning's battle were still being pulled from the water, a new threat appeared. A Japanese Zero fighter, part of one of the first organized kamikaze attacks of the war, dove into the flight deck of the escort carrier St. Lo. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck where armed and fueled aircraft were stored. Secondary explosions ripped the ship apart. St. Lo sank within 30 minutes, becoming the first major warship in history to be destroyed by a suicide aircraft attack. The final toll was devastating. Taffy 3 lost 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay and St. Lo. They lost 2 destroyers, Johnston and Hoel. They lost 1 destroyer escort, Samuel B Roberts. Approximately 1,161 American sailors were killed or missing. Another 913 were wounded. 23 aircraft were lost. The Japanese lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk, Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, with a 4th, Kumano, crippled beyond repair and later sunk by aircraft. Multiple other ships were damaged. Over 2,700 Japanese sailors died. But the battle's human cost extended far beyond the action itself. Survivors from the 4 sunken surface ships were not rescued for nearly 2 days. Poor coordination, continuing kamikaze attacks, and erroneous position reports left approximately 1,700 men struggling in the open ocean without food or fresh water. Sharks were a constant presence in those warm Philippine waters. The thrashing of wounded men and the blood in the water drew them in from miles around. Survivors remembered hearing screams in the darkness, then silence, as shipmates were pulled beneath the surface. One survivor from Johnston recalled watching helplessly as a shark circled his life raft, then pulled under a man who had been swimming alongside just moments before. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, and the tropical night brought no relief from the terror. Men, maddened by thirst, drank seawater, which only hastened their dehydration and sent them into delirium. They hallucinated, seeing phantom islands and rescue ships that did not exist. Some swam away from life rafts toward these imaginary shores. They were never seen again. Others died quietly from wounds that would have been survivable with medical attention. Internal bleeding, shock, infection, all claimed lives that might have been saved had rescue come sooner. The survivors could do nothing but watch their shipmates slip away. Making matters worse, the rescue effort was plagued by miscommunication and competing priorities. The kamikaze attacks that sank St. Lo had drawn all available rescue craft to help those survivors. Reports of submarine contacts kept some ships at general quarters rather than searching for survivors, and the position coordinates given for the sunken ships were inaccurate, sending rescue vessels to the wrong locations. The breakdown of losses for Johnston was especially devastating. 49 men died in the battle itself. 45 more died of wounds while clinging to life rafts. 92, including Commander Evans, were alive in the water after the ship sank but vanished without a trace, taken by sharks or exhaustion or despair. Rescue finally came on the night of October 26th. A 7-ship detail personally ordered by Admiral Kincaid found the first survivors that evening. The last Johnston raft, carrying 15 men, was located at 9:30 on the morning of October 27th, 48 hours after the ship went down. Samuel B Roberts survivors endured approximately 50 hours in the open sea before rescue. In the years that followed, the Navy recognized the extraordinary heroism of Taffy 3's sailors with an unprecedented number of awards. Commander Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. He became the first Native American in the United States Navy to be so honored. His widow Margaret received the medal in a ceremony at San Pedro, California, on September 28, 1945. Their 2 sons stood beside her as she accepted the award. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland received the Navy Cross and went on to resume his law practice in Tacoma. He eventually rose to the rank of Rear Admiral in the Naval Reserve and wrote a memoir called The Spirit of the Sammy B before his death in 1973. Commander Amos Hathaway of Heermann, the only Taffy 3 destroyer to survive the battle, received the Navy Cross. After retiring from the Navy, he became a professor of mathematics at the Citadel. The entire task unit received the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism in action. In recent years, advances in deep-sea exploration have allowed us to visit the final resting places of these ships. In October 2019, the research vessel Petrel located the wreck of USS Johnston at the edge of an undersea cliff in the Philippine Trench. In March 2021, explorer Victor Vescovo definitively surveyed the wreck at a depth of more than 21,000 feet. Her hull number, 557, was clearly visible through the submarine's cameras. Her 5-inch guns remained trained to starboard, still pointing toward the enemy. In June 2022, Vescovo's team discovered the wreck of USS Samuel B Roberts at approximately 22,500 feet. She is the deepest known shipwreck in the world. The aft gun mount where Paul Carr made his last stand remains identifiable on the ocean floor, more than 4 miles beneath the surface. The wrecks of Gambier Bay and Hoel have never been found. The Battle off Samar was just one of 4 separate engagements that together comprised the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Over 4 days, from October 23rd through 26th, 282 ships and nearly 200,000 sailors clashed across more than 100,000 square miles of ocean. The battle witnessed several historic firsts and lasts. It was the last time battleships exchanged gunfire, when Kincaid's old battle wagons annihilated Nishimura's southern force in Surigao Strait. It was the first time kamikazes were used as an organized tactical weapon. It was the end of Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force, and effectively, the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a credible military threat. The Japanese lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. 26 ships totaling over 300,000 tons went to the bottom. More than 10,000 Japanese sailors and airmen died. The surviving ships of the combined fleet would never again operate as a cohesive force. From this point forward, Japanese naval resistance would consist of suicide attacks and isolated operations by ships too damaged or fuel-starved to conduct normal operations. For the Americans, the victory secured the Philippines and cut Japan off from the resources of Southeast Asia. Without oil from the Dutch East Indies, without rubber from Malaya, without the rice and minerals that flowed through Philippine ports, the Japanese war machine would slowly starve. The end was now inevitable, even if many more months of bloody fighting remained. But within that vast canvas of destruction, the action off Samar stands apart. 13 ships that had no business fighting a surface engagement against 23 capital warships not only survived but inflicted decisive damage and turned the enemy back. Naval historians have struggled to explain it. James Hornfisher, whose book The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors won the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for Naval Literature, called it the greatest upset in the history of naval warfare. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had witnessed the entire Pacific War from his headquarters in Hawaii, concluded that Taffy 3's survival was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. Perhaps Admiral Sprague himself offered the most complete explanation when he later reflected on how his tiny force had survived. He attributed it to their successful smokescreen, their torpedo counterattack, continuous harassment of the enemy by aircraft, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God. But there was another factor that no tactical analysis could fully capture. It was the factor that sent Ernest Evans charging toward the Japanese fleet before any order was given. It was the factor that kept Paul Carr loading shells with his body torn open. It was the factor that made Robert Copeland tell his men they would do what damage they could, even though survival could not be expected. The men of Taffy 3 did not fight because they thought they could win. They fought because the alternative was unthinkable. Somewhere behind them, in Leyte Gulf, were hundreds of transport ships carrying soldiers and supplies for the invasion. If the Japanese fleet reached those ships, the slaughter would be beyond calculation. So they charged. Destroyers against battleships, 5-inch guns against 18-inch guns, 3,000 tons against 64,000 tons. They charged because running was not an option. They charged because that is what sailors do. The Japanese captain who saluted the sinking Johnston understood this. Across the vast gulf of war and culture and language, he recognized something universal in what he had witnessed. He had seen men choose duty over survival, and he honored them for it. In November 2023, the Navy announced that a new Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, hull number DDG-141, would be named USS Ernest E. Evans. More than 79 years after his death, the Cherokee and Creek officer from Oklahoma will once again sail the seas, his name carried by a warship defending the nation he died to protect. Today, the names of these ships and sailors are inscribed on memorials from Manila to Washington. Ernest Evans' name appears on the walls of the missing at Manila American Cemetery, alongside 36,000 other Pacific fighters whose bodies were never recovered. More than 80 years have passed since that October morning when colored geysers began erupting around the escort carriers of Taffy 3. The last survivors of the battle have joined their shipmates. The ships themselves lie scattered across the floor of the Philippine Sea, preserved by the crushing pressure and eternal darkness of the deep ocean. But the story endures. It endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature when faced with impossible odds. It endures because it reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. It endures because those 2 hours off, Samar proved that the outcome of any fight is never certain until the last gun falls silent. Commander Evans told his crew at the commissioning ceremony that he intended to go in harm's way. On October 25, 1944, he kept that promise. So did every man who followed him into the fire. In no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours off Samar. Those words belong to Samuel Eliot Morrison, writing years after the fact with the benefit of distance and perspective. But the men who earned that tribute had no such luxury. They had only the sea, the smoke, the thunder of guns, and the choice that every warrior must eventually face. They chose to fight, and in choosing, they passed into legend.